The 62nd plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. Before proceeding further, as mentioned in my letter dated 28 August 2020, I would like to remind members of the following mitigation measures that are in place for this meeting. All delegates are required to wear a face mask covering at all times in public spaces and in the General Assembly Hall except when directly addressing the meeting. All staff are also required to wear face coverings at all times. Disposable face masks are available if needed. All delegates are to refrain from direct contact, including handshakes and other physical contact during greetings in recognition of the physical distancing requirements. All delegates should remain conscious of COVID-19, hand sanitizing, and contact precautions. All movement and, if necessary, queuing requires 2-meter physical distancing, and delegates are requested to minimize activity until seated in the meeting room. All statements will be made by delegations from the national seats. With the assistance of the occupational safety and health representatives, I will oversee the implementation of the mitigation measures in the course of the proceedings. If at any time it appears that the guidelines are not being strictly observed, I will have no choice but to draw the attention of delegates to these guidelines. I thank you for cooperation in this regard. Before proceeding to the items on our agenda, I would like, in keeping with established practice, to draw the attention of the General Assembly to documents A/74/642/Agenda 6 and 7, in which the Secretary General informs the President of the General Assembly that since the issuance of his communication contained in document A/74/642/Addendum 5, the Gambia and the Central African Republic have made the necessary payments to reduce their arrears below the amount specified in Article 19 of the Charter. May I take it that the General Assembly takes note of the information contained in these documents? It is so decided. The General Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 7, entitled Organization of Work, Adoption of the Agenda, and Allocation of Items. Members recall that in a letter dated 24 March 2020, I transmitted a draft decision entitled Procedure for Taking Decisions of the General Assembly during the Coronavirus Disease COVID-19 Pandemic, enabling the Assembly to adopt decisions during COVID-19 pandemic, placing it under a silence procedure until 27 March 2020 at 12 noon. Members will also recall that in a subsequent letter dated 27 March 2020, I informed delegations that the silence procedure on the draft decision had concluded without objections, and that the draft decision was considered adopted by the General Assembly as Decision 74/544 and was in effect from 12:01 p.m. of that day. In the same letter, I also informed delegations that the General Assembly would take note of the decision at its next plenary meeting held at the United Nations headquarters. I also enclosed in the same letter statements received from some member states. Excellencies, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the General Assembly Hall for the first in-person plenary meeting since March of this year. I thank you for your adherence to social and physical distancing guidelines today and throughout this period. Although we may not have convened in this hall since March, New York-based delegations have worked tirelessly to uphold the values and principles set out in the Charter of the United Nations whilst contending with the COVID-19 pandemic. As the chief deliberative body of the United Nations, this Assembly has continued the work of our organization throughout the period. It has done so in full partnership with the Secretariat and all other UN organs. I commend you for your foresight in adopting decisions 74/544 and 74/555, which have allowed the membership to adopt more than 70 resolutions and elect chairs of the main committees for the 25th session of the General Assembly. This has ensured business continuity on critical issues for the Assembly and for the United Nations. I uphold your work in the intergovernmental negotiations on the declaration for the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the United Nations. I also thank the member states who have demonstrated leadership in responding to this global pandemic by adopting 2 resolutions with wide co-sponsorship, calling for solidarity and global access to vaccines, to medicines and medical equipment. I thank the chair of the 5th committees, or the committees, co-coordinators, co-facilitators, and co-chairs for the work they have done this session. I also congratulate the chair of the 5th committee for adopting creative methods to successfully conclude the resumed session with more than 20 draft recommendations and authorizing a peacekeeping budget of $6.5 billion for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. This has ensured that the United Nations can continue to operate on the ground and meet the needs of the people we serve, even under extraordinary circumstances. The General Assembly successfully organized socially distanced elections for the General Assembly Presidency, the Security Council, and the Economic and Social Council. Furthermore, we employed virtual methods to gather stakeholders from around the world on Charter Day, and once again at the multi-stakeholder hearing on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the first World Conference on Women. I thank the Secretariat for their continued commitment to ensuring business continuity of the Assembly, which has made this work possible. Excellencies, today's meeting takes place as many people suffer and bear great losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I uphold the World Health Organization for leading the response from the outset. I also acknowledge the leadership of the Secretary General and the President of ECOSOC. The entire UN system has rallied to address the needs of the people we serve. I pay particular thanks to our humanitarian workers in the field and our peacekeepers who continue to protect communities in the most complex environments around the world. These efforts are critical as we begin the decade of action and delivery to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, or as it is likely to become the decade of recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I urge you to galvanize multilateral action now and fulfill our financing for development and other commitments. We remain in this together. I thank you. May I take it that the General Assembly wishes to take note of Decision 74/544 entitled Procedure for Taking Decisions of the General Assembly during the coronavirus disease COVID-19 pandemic? I hear no objection. It is so decided. The General Assembly will now turn to the resolutions and decisions that were adopted through silence procedure from March till end of August 2020. Members will recall that in its decision 74/544 of 27 March 2020, entitled Procedure for Taking Decisions of the General Assembly during the Coronavirus Disease 2019, COVID-19, the General Assembly decided that if the silence is not broken, the decision shall be considered adopted, and the General Assembly shall take note of the decision at its first plenary meeting held after the cessation of the precautionary measures as soon as the circumstances allow. Accordingly, the Assembly will take note of the following resolutions and decisions. Resolution 74/269 of 31 March 2020, entitled Scope, Modalities, Format and Organization of the Summit on Biodiversity. Resolutions 74/261B of 31 March 2020 and 74/261C of June 30, 2020, entitled Financing of the African Union United Nations Hybrid Operation in Darfur. Decision 74/545 of 2 April 2020, entitled 72nd Session of the International Law Commission. Decision 74/546 of 2 April 2020, entitled Disarmament Commission. Resolution 74/270 of 2 April 2020, entitled Global Solidarity to Fight the Coronavirus Disease 2019, COVID-19, whose additional co-sponsors are listed in Document A/74/L52, Addendum 1. Decision 74/547 of 13 April 2020, entitled Interactive Dialogue on Harmony with Nature. Decision 74/548 of 13 April 2020, entitled 2020 United Nations Conference to Support the Implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 14, Conserve and Sustainably Use the Oceans, Seas and Marine Resources for Sustainable Development. Decision 74/549 of 13 April 2020, entitled Fourth Conference of Nuclear Weapon-Free Zones and Mongolia 2020. Decision 74/550A of 13 April 2020 and 74/550B of 12 August 2020, entitled 14th United Nations Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. Decision 74/406B of 13 April and 5 June 2020, entitled Appointment of Members of the Committee on Contributions. Decision 74/409B of 13 April 2020, entitled Appointment of Members of the Independent Audit Advisory Committee. Resolution 74/271 of 13 April 2020, entitled Progress Towards an Accountability System in the United Nations Secretariat. Decision 74/540B of 13 April 2020 and 74/540C of 13 July 2020, entitled Questions Deferred for Future Consideration. Resolution 74/272 of 13 April 2020, entitled Construction of a New Facility for the International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals, Arusha Branch. Resolution 74/273 of 20 April 2020, entitled International Day of Reflection on the 1994 Genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, whose additional co-sponsors are listed in Document A/74/L40, Addendum 1. Resolution 74/274 of 20 April 2020, entitled International Cooperation to Ensure Global Access to Medicines, Vaccines, and Medical Equipment to Face COVID-19, whose additional co-sponsors are listed in Document A/74/L56, Addendum 1. Decision 74/551 of 14 May 2020, entitled High-Level Dialogue to Assess the Progress Made in the Fight Against Desertification, Land Degradation, and Drought to Map the Way Forward. Decision 74/552 of 14 May 2020, entitled Sabin's Biennial Meeting of States to Consider the Implementation of the Program of Action to Prevent, Combat, and Eradicate the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects. Decision 74/553 of 14 May 2020, entitled 20th Session of the High-Level Committee on South-South Cooperation. Decision 74/554 of 14 May 2020, entitled 21st Meeting of the United Nations Open-Ended Informal Consultative Process on Oceans and the Law of the Sea. Decision 74/555 of 15 May 2020, entitled Extension of the Procedure for Taking Decisions of the General Assembly during the Coronavirus Disease COVID-19 Pandemic. Decision 74/555 of 20 May 2020, entitled The United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy. Resolution 74/275 of 28 May 2020, entitled International Day to Protect education from attack, whose additional co-sponsors are listed in document A/74/L66/Addendum 1. Decision 74/557 of 29 May 2020 entitled Procedure for Holding Elections by Secret Ballot Without a Plenary Meeting During the Coronavirus Disease COVID-19 Pandemic. Resolution 74/276 of 1 June 2020 entitled Special Session of the General Assembly Against Corruption. Decision 74/558 of 18 June 2020 entitled Extension of the Procedure for Taking Decisions of the General Assembly during the Coronavirus Disease COVID-19 Pandemic until the end of July 2020. Resolution 74/277 of 18 June 2020 entitled Comprehensive Review of the Whole Question of Peacekeeping Operations in All Their Aspects. Decision 74/559 of 23 June 2020 entitled Postponement of the 22nd Session of the International Law Commission. Decision 74/420 of 29 June 2020 entitled Election of the Vice President of the General Assembly at its 75th session. Resolution 74/249B of 30 June 2020 entitled Financial Reports and Audited Financial Statements and Reports of the Board of Auditors. Resolution 74/260B of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Mission for Justice Support in Haiti. Resolution 74/278 of 30 June 2020 entitled Closed Peacekeeping Missions. Resolution 74/279 of 30 June 2020 entitled Triennial Review of the Rates and Standards for Reimbursement to Member States for Contingent-Owned Equipment. Resolution 74/280 of 30 June 2020 entitled Support Account for Peacekeeping Operations. Resolution 74/281 of 30 June entitled Financing of the Regional Service Center in Entebbe, Uganda. Resolution 74/282 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Logistics Base in Brindisi, Italy. Resolution 74/283 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Interim Security Force for Abyei. Resolution 74/284 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Multinational Integrated Stabilization Mission in the Central African Republic. Resolution 74/285 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Cyprus. Resolution 74/286 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Resolution 74/287 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti. Resolution 74/288 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo. Resolution 74/289 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Mission in Liberia. Resolution 74/290 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali. Resolution 74/291 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Disengagement of Daba Force. Resolution 74/292 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. Resolution 74/293 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Mission in South Sudan. Resolution 74/294 of 30 June 2020 entitled Financing of the United Nations Mission for the Referendum in Western Sahara. Resolution 74/295 of 30 June 2020 entitled financing of the activities arising from Security Council Resolution 1863, bracket 2009. Decision 74/560 of 6 July 2020, entitled Building a Peaceful and Better World Through Sport and the Olympic Ideal. Resolution 74/296 of 13 July 2020, entitled Global Service Delivery Model. Decision 74/561 of 21 July 2020, entitled Extension of the Procedure for Taking Decisions of the General Assembly during the coronavirus disease COVID-19 pandemic until the end of August 2020. Decision 74/562 of 22 July 2020, entitled High-Level Meetings of the General Assembly in September 2020. Resolution 74/254B of 6 August 2020, entitled Seconded Active Duty Military and Police Personnel. Resolution 74/232B of 11 August 2020, entitled Follow-up to the 4th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries. Resolution 74/297 of 11 August 2020, entitled Progress in the Implementation of General Assembly Resolution 71/243 on the quadrennial comprehensive policy review of operational activities for development of the United Nations system. Decision 74/537B of 11 August 2020, entitled Revitalization of the Work of the Second Committee. Decision 74/563 of 12 August 2020, entitled Closing Date of the 74th Session of the General Assembly. Resolution 74/298 of 12 August 2020, entitled Review of the Implementation of the General Assembly Resolution 67/290 on the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, Resolution 70/299 on the follow-up and review of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development at the global level, and Resolution 74/305 on the strengthening of the Economic and Social Council. Decision 74/564 of 12 August 2020, entitled Review of the United Nations Peacekeeping Architecture. Decision 74/565 of 12 August 2020, entitled Informal Interactive Hearing with Indigenous Peoples. Decision 74/566 of 12 August 2020, entitled Extension of the Term of the Office of the Current Members of the International Law Commission and Other Related Matters. Decision 74/567 of 14 August 2020, entitled Ad hoc Committee to elaborate a comprehensive international convention on countering the use of information and communication technologies for criminal purposes. Resolution 74/299 of 31 August 2020, entitled Improving Global Road Safety, whose additional co-sponsors are listed in document A/74/L86 Addendum 1. Decision 74/568 of 31 August 2020, entitled Special Session of the General Assembly Against Corruption. Decision 74/402B of 31 August 2020, entitled Appointment of Members of the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions. Decision 74/569 of 31 August 2020, entitled Question of Equitable Representation on and Increase in the Membership of the Security Council and Other Matters Related to the Security Council. Decision 74/503B of 31 March 2020, to consider Agenda Item 163 directly in the plenary of 2 April 2020 to reopen consideration of Agenda Items 79 and 100B, and to consider them directly in the plenary of 13 April 2020 to reopen consideration of Agenda Item 106, and to consider it directly in the plenary to reopen consideration of Agenda Item 115B, and to consider Agenda Items 133 and 147 directly in the plenary of May 14, 2020 to open consideration of agenda item 19E and to consider it directly in the plenary and to consider agenda item 23B directly in the plenary. Of 11 August 2020 to consider agenda item 21A directly in the plenary and to open consideration of agenda item 23A and to consider it directly in the plenary. Of 12 August 2020 to open consideration of agenda item 67 and to consider it directly in the plenary. Of 14 August 2020 to open consideration of agenda item 107 and to consider it directly in the plenary. And of 31 August 2020 to open consideration of agenda item 115A and to consider it directly in the plenary.